Our first speaker is Ben Page, who's the Gordon Scott Fulcher Professor of Decision Making at Northwestern University. And I won't give a long speech other than to say that Ben is my advisor, and I think if it weren't for Ben, I'd be doing some other job that wouldn't be as fun, like driving a taxi or something. So Ben is, you know how it is. So. Anyway, yes, blame Ben for everything. Anyway, it's a delight to have Ben. I'll introduce Chris afterwards with this. So we'll start with Ben. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ken. It's always good to be back in Ann Arbor, and it reminds me of the first time when, in the ancient past, I mean really ancient past, I was a graduate student at the summer program of ICPSR, which did not have the S at that time. And I learned a lot of really good things, but strangely, I don't remember that as clearly as I remember a lot of parties and a lot of running around the stadium track at midnight, which people tell me is harder to do now, but I bet if you're determined, I bet you can do it. Okay, what I want to do is focus for a second on the word thwarted, which is probably the key word for what I want to say today. Because the way in which average citizens fail to get what they want, to a very large extent, is failing to get policy changes. That is, if the majority of the public's against something, it usually doesn't happen. But if they want it, it also usually doesn't happen. Okay, let me provide a little context. Trump is on my mind partly because I spent last week in China trying to explain him to the Chinese, which was quite an endeavor. But I think he's related to this subject today. I believe that both Trump and Sanders have and did have, still have, a large part of their appeal because so many Americans feel that the two major parties have not been doing well for them. Government policy has not respected their wishes. Now, let me start with stuff that pretty much all of you know, the familiar evidence that when public opinion moves in a certain direction, generally speaking, it's true that a little while afterwards, public policy responds to one degree or other. And it's going to turn out it's important to what degree. But there are some problems with this work. Part of it represents the sins of my own past. We used the word effects in the title of that 1983 article, effects of public opinion on policy. I don't think we really showed effects. And we hemmed and hawed in the article and gave lots of caveats, but still we used the word. The problem with, so far as I know, all the research of this general type, and of course there's lots more, I think comes in these major ways. The first problem is that relationship, even though it's an overtime relationship, is almost certainly spurious. That is, there's not really a causal impact of the opinions of the general public on policymaking. And I'll review some of the evidence about that. A second point is one that seems to have got lost in most of these discussions. And that is that when you talk about representativeness, that to most people means something a little more than this responsiveness thing. Like Bob and I, for example, just showed that policy tended to move in the same direction. But we didn't show by how much, and we didn't show that it ended up where people wanted it to be. Chris Aiken, a long time ago in connection with the early Miller and Stokes work, pointed out this distinction between slope and intercept, basically, between responsiveness and this other aspect of representation. Then another point, which follows from the first, and I'll review with you some of the evidence that actually affluent Americans have most of the impact on policy. And when you take account of that, average citizens have almost none. We also don't know exactly which among the affluent are having that influence. And affluent is a much better word in this context than rich or wealthy or something, because this comes from national surveys. It's just the top 20% of income earners. And at the time that Marty did his work, Marty Gillen's, that meant an income of about $80,000 a year, which most people would not call rich. That's sort of barely upper middle class. There's now evidence from various places that suggests that really wealthy people within that category of affluent have a large part of the influence. And furthermore, that what they want from government policy is quite different from what average people do. My own current research is on multimillionaires and billionaires, two separate studies, and I'll give you a little bit of the results of that. Okay, I would argue that Marty's data are the best for exploring these issues of influence, the best available now. One of the advantages is that they cover a whole bunch of issues, almost 1,800 of them, over a long period of time. So you can look at what happens in different types of issues and at different times and so forth. Another advantage is that he went to all the work of gathering the data from these many different surveys and figuring out by basically extrapolating, quadratic extrapolation, estimating the opinion of the individual at what he calls the 90th percentile. That's a person who's in the middle of the top 20% of the income distribution. That's the affluent. And then people at the 50th percentile, that's theoretically different but practically almost identical to just the average American. Marty also gathered data on interest groups, and this is sort of a quick and dirty measure. On the other hand, it works amazingly well, and it leads me to believe that if you had a better measure of interest groups, you'd find even more influence by them than he does. And then once you have these data, it's possible to do a little multivariate analysis. I should say that this really is Marty's data. He spent 10 years gathering, analyzing, and so forth. I was sort of a last-minute free rider, and I got together with him on this article in which what we added was a little reframing, thinking differently about what these data speak to, but also a simple multivariate model, because his treatment of interest groups had been a little complicated and most people didn't fully see what was happening there. So we used a simple multivariate model. I mentioned an important thing, which is that Marty worked out a very clever system of correcting for correlated measurement error in surveys, because he's using the same surveys to judge what average people think and what affluent people think. But of course, anything that's wrong with a given survey, whether it's sampling error, question wording oddities, almost anything else, is going to apply to both groups. So that as you look across issues, some of the variation will be in common to both groups. That means that the errors in measurement will basically be correlated. And he has a clever system that you can see in his book, Affluence and Influence, for dealing with that. Okay, let's take a minute to look at some simple bivariate relationships in these data, the variables I was just mentioning. The first thing to notice is the upper left, very substantial correlation between affluent citizens' preferences and average citizens' preferences. In the raw data, it's actually much higher, Chris probably knows exactly what it is. Do you happen to remember?
I think it's 0.94.
It's 0.9 something,
0.94,
for sure.
yeah.
So it's possible to argue based on the raw data that these things are virtually identical. On the other hand, when Marty does his correction for correlated error, he estimates the coefficient to actually be 0.78, and if you square that to get a sense, what is that, 0.61 or something, it's, you can see that there's actually enough difference now between the two groups that you can have some hope of sorting out their separate influence in a little multivariate model. A couple of other comments. You can actually stare at this little correlation matrix for a while and notice a number of interesting things, I think. One of them is, look at interest group alignments and that 0.04 relationship with average citizens' preferences. David Truman would not like that finding, I think. What that's telling you is that for the whole interest group universe, measuring the alignment of groups on each of these 1,800 policies, if you correlate those alignments with what average citizens want on the issues, it's darn near zero. This is not pluralistic, majoritarian kind of interest group setup. Another thing you notice is that business groups have a small negative correlation with what average people favor. But the most curious thing really is these so-called mass-based groups, which, when you take them as a whole, again, people sort of figure, well, you know, there are women's groups and gun owners groups, and there's everybody's groups. When you put them all together, presumably they represent all of us. Not so. It turns out that, in fact, there's a very small positive relationship at 0.12. Another point is, notice that the preferences of affluent Americans are actually unrelated to these interest group alignments. That was a big surprise to me, because a lot of affluent people are CEOs or middle managers of business firms, and most of the interest groups are business groups, but there's essentially zero relationship. And among other things, that means that we're going to get a nice, clean estimate of the distinct impact of those two different sets of actors, affluent individuals and interest groups. Let's see, anything else to say? Well, you can see that business groups dominate the scene of interest groups. That's partly because they take stands on a lot more issues, they're more active, and there are more of them. They spend more money and so forth. So that gives you kind of a sense of the independent variables that we worked with. Here's the kind of the bottom line estimates of impact. As I say, simple multivariate model, except that the independent variables are logits to account for curvilinearity. That is, you would expect that as you tip between slightly positive and slightly negative, it might have more impact than if you change from wildly negative to a little less wildly negative and so forth. So what you see is that average citizens' preferences have a non-significant impact. That's a very little coefficient. Affluent citizens, very substantial impact. And then among the interest groups, we lumped all the groups together, and you get a coefficient that's roughly like that 0.43. I think it's slightly bigger, but not much. When you separate them, you find that the business-oriented interest groups, that's corporations, business associations, and the like, have a pretty substantial impact, not quite as big as affluent citizens. And the mass-based interest groups, less so. That's another reason that David Truman, I think, would not be very happy about this, because not only are the mass-based interest groups not particularly representative in the aggregate of the public as a whole, they don't have that much impact anyway. We're not getting democracy, we're not getting democratic representation via interest groups. So this is maybe kind of the central thing from Marty's and my work. And I suspect Chris may have some challenges for it. So if you get that in your mind, we can move on to a picture of, this is the same information, but this is the flat line graph that Ezra Klein and other people got excited about on the internet. There is a very slight positive slope. You saw that 0.05 coefficient, but there's just not much going on there. Think about it for a minute. That means that if 10 or only, put it the other way, if 90% of Americans favor a policy change, holding constant these other groups, that is, this is predicted probability of policy change on the vertical axis, and its preferences of average citizens on the horizontal axis. When 90% of Americans want policy change, controlling the other groups, that only happens about 0.35, about a third of the time. When only 10 or 20% want policy change, it also happens about 33% of the time. Essentially, this is just a visual way of getting a hold of that little teeny 0.05 coefficient. So now we get to what may or may not be the nub of any disagreements we have today, and that is that Chris and Stuart and others have pointed out, very articulately and correctly, that if it's the case that affluent Americans agree most of the time with ordinary Americans, the normative picture is quite a bit different than if they don't. Maybe this whole influence thing doesn't matter all that much. Well, these are my answers to those questions, and Marty's given similar, although not identical, answers in print in various places. First of all, as Marty says, it's a feeble sort of democracy if average people have no influence. Even if they get what they want most of the time, that's precarious. You know, what if the elites change their minds? Then, boom, they can shut it down. Furthermore, it turns out there really are substantial differences. And here we get back to this correlated measurement error business, because if you take a 0.94 correlation, sure, in the raw data, the affluents and average Americans are saying pretty much the same thing most of the time about most issues. But when you take account of correlated measurement error, there are differences. And these, in fact, some of them are quite important. But here's where Marty's emphasis and mine are a little different, partly because I've been studying millionaires and billionaires. And it's my belief that these affluents are mostly an indicator of the preferences of much more wealthy people. That is, they differ from the average in the same direction that wealthy people do, but truly wealthy people have really different preferences. And I'll show you a bit of evidence on that in a moment. Then a final point about this is that none of this stuff about responsiveness tells you anything about how often the general public actually gets what it wants. Because you could have perfect responsiveness, and yet every single time there's a big difference between what policy is and what people want. For example, if something exogenous is changing what people want, say they want more and more and more Social Security benefits, or they're worried more and more about climate change, and policy moves in that same direction, nonetheless, there might be a chasm between the two. And I think I'll be able to show you a little evidence of that. Usually, it's not possible to even consider, because usually we don't have policy measured on the same scale as opinion. So the intercept is sort of artificial. It's meaningless. All right, let's approach.
5 more minutes, is that it?
Sure. Yeah, we're near the end here. First, this is the point about the truly wealthy. This is from the CISA study of top 1% wealth earners, which roughly is $8 or $10 million people. These are a lot more wealthy than Marty's affluent. And I'm not going to go through all these, but you notice, why did the difference not show up?
It's underneath.
It's on the left.
Oh,
It's underneath. It's the plus
Yeah.
25.
Formatting issue.
Yeah.
okay. All right, I guess that works out all right. You can see by looking at those differences, they're big. By looking at the percentages, you can see that on a whole bunch of these issues, all Americans in national surveys have majority support for these policy changes, most of them. And in pretty much every case, these millionaires do not. And then if you get non-quantitative and look at what public policy we have, you tend to find that the millionaires are coming out pretty well. Here, I want you to look at this one very closely because Marty and I did not put it in our article. It's in his book, page 73 or so, but I think he doesn't jump up and down enough about it, so not everybody's noticed the significance. What you got here is a raw bivariate relationship in Marty's data of 1,800 issues of horizontally what percentage of Americans favor a policy change, and then vertically what proportion of the time it happens. The first thing you see is positive slope. That seems to be responsiveness, okay? Even if it's spurious, there's something there. But the key is sort of about the intercept, that even when 80% of Americans favor a policy change, they only get it about 40% of the time. In a changing world where policy change is in many people's minds really needed on a whole bunch of areas, that means that the public's being thwarted in a major way. Not only when there's, like a 60% pretty solid majority, then people get their way maybe 30% of the time. But as I say, when it's like 80%, 70 or 80, they get only 40% of the time. This to me is the most important graph in Marty's book. So I think I'm at the end. This is a little ad for the book we're doing. And after talking about how terrible things are from a normative democratic theory point of view, we go into a lot of reforms and fantasize about how they might actually occur.
Thanks,
That's it.
Ben.